Chapter 1. The Breaking Point. The heavy wooden table creaked beneath her as Azuron lifted her onto it, his grip iron-tight around her waist. The room was dim, the flickering glow of candlelight casting wicked shadows across his face. Sharp angles, darkened eyes, lips parted as if caught between hunger and restraint. Sienna's breath hitched. She should push him away. She should fight. But she didn't. Azuron's fingers traced up her spine, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the feeling of her. He exhaled against her lips, the heat of it sending a shudder through her body. His forehead rested against hers, a cruel tease of closeness.
Tell me to stop.
His voice was low, a growl laced with unspoken agony. Sienna's hands fisted in his shirt. Her pulse pounded, drowning out all rational thought. He was too close, his scent, smoke, steel, and something dangerously addictive, wrapping around her like a noose. Azuron let out a rough chuckle, barely moving, but his hand slid lower, fingers pressing into her thighs, spreading her legs just enough to make her body betray her.
I will ruin you,
he murmured, lips grazing her jaw, the promise in his voice a dark temptation.
and I'll make sure you love every second of it.
His mouth finally crashed against hers. It wasn't gentle. It was years of denial and obsession breaking all at once. Her body arched into him as he devoured her, his teeth scraping against her bottom lip, demanding more. He tasted like power, like sin, like everything she should have run from, and she kissed him back like she had been waiting for this. Months ago, she had hated him. Months ago, she had been his prisoner. Months ago, she had sworn she would never let him touch her, but that was before everything changed. Months earlier. The doors burst open behind him, and Sienna gasped as a pair of soldiers dragged her forward, her arms bound in shackles. She stumbled, her knees hitting the marble with a sharp crack. The court's murmurs grew louder, horror rippling through the onlookers. Azuron, covered in blood, turned to her. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. Crimson splattered across his coat. The scent of iron lingered in the air. His eyes, dark as the storm outside, locked onto hers as he took a step forward. And then, he knelt before her. The room held its breath.
You will marry me now.
His voice was calm, steady, undeniable.
You are mine now.
Sienna's pulse roared in her ears. She turned toward her father, but the king's face was ashen, his fury trapped behind his own helplessness. The war had been lost. Their kingdom was dust. Her throat tightened.
You can't just marry me like that.
I can...
Azuron's fingers ghosted over the chain linking her wrists. Then, in a single decisive movement, he snapped the shackles apart, with a force that sent the broken metal clattering to the floor. Her freedom was no closer. It never had been. There was no ceremony, no priest, no vows spoken before an audience. Just the throne room, the weight of her fate pressing against her chest. Azuron turned to her, his expression unreadable. He met her gaze without hesitation and spoke, his voice steady and commanding.
We both accept each other as husband and wife.
It was not a question. It was a decree. Before she could breathe, before she could think, he claimed her lips. The kiss was not gentle. It was not sweet. It was a warning, not a promise. His fingers gripped her jaw, firm but not cruel, as he stole the last piece of her defiance. He kissed her not as a lover, but as a conqueror. Sienna did not close her eyes. She refused to give him that. She tried to push him away, but he was way stronger than her. Then he pulled back slowly, his gaze locked onto hers. He studied her like a man examining something he already owned. And then, just low enough for only her to hear, he whispered,
You are mine now. I think we're going to have a lot of fun, Princess.
Chapter 2. The abduction. Sienna's pulse was a wild thing in her throat, but she refused to look away. Azuron's thumb still rested against her chin, his bare hand hot against her skin, a cruel contrast to the cold dread curling in her stomach.
I think we're going to have a lot of fun, Princess.
The words slithered over her like silk smooth, dark and suffocating. Her father moved first.
If you lay a single hand on her...
Azuron sighed. The sound was calm, almost bored, as he released her and turned to face the king.
That's twice now you've threatened me.
He tilted his head, his fingers brushing against the hilt of the sword at his hip.
You seem to have forgotten. You lost this war.
The king clenched his jaw.
She is not part of your spoils.
Azuron turned back to Sienna. His gaze dropped lower this time, down the length of her throat, over the tight clench of her hands in her lap, to the trembling of her gown against her legs. He wasn't just looking at her. He was studying her, memorizing her. Then he stepped closer. Sienna's breath stilled. Azuron moved slowly, his every step unhurried, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on her with an invisible force. She gritted her teeth.
You can't.
Oh, but I can.
And then, without warning, he grabbed her wrist. His fingers locked around her skin, firm but not painful. Not yet. The entire room tensed. Sienna's father lunged. It was a mistake. Azuron barely shifted. With a flick of his wrist, a second blade, hidden beneath his coat, slid into his opposite hand. The edge of the dagger glinted as he brought it up, stopping just short of the king's throat. A sharp gasp rang through the hall. The king froze. Azuron's voice remained calm, quiet, almost soft.
Don't make me hurt you in front of your daughter.
Sienna yanked against his grip, but it was like iron. He turned to her, gaze dropping to her struggle. And then, to her horror, he smiled. Not a grin, not amusement, something darker, hungrier. Sienna's stomach twisted. Azuron leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a near whisper.
Come willingly, and I'll be gentle with you.
The implication was clear. Her heartbeat pounded, her vision narrowing on his lips as they curved in satisfaction. Sienna hated him, and yet, something in her burned. Her father was still standing there, trapped in place by the threat of the blade at his throat. She knew she had no choice. Sienna lifted her chin. Nah.
Then do your worst, villain.
Azuron let out a low, deep chuckle, a sound that slid down her spine like a promise. And then, in one smooth motion, he pulled her against him. Her body collided with his chest, the sheer heat of him searing through the fabric of her gown. His scent wrapped around her, smoke, leather, something undeniably male. She opened her mouth, to curse him, to fight him. But before she could, he bent down. His lips brushed her ear.
You don't want my worst, princess.
And then, darkness. A sharp jolt, a pull. The sensation of falling. And the last thing she heard was the distant, panicked shouting of her father, growing fainter and fainter until nothing. Chapter 3. The ride into darkness. The world lurched. Sienna's body jerked violently, her senses snapping back as the chill of the night bit into her skin. She was moving. Fast. Wind whipped past her face, her vision adjusting to the blur of dark trees rushing by. The ground was far below. Too far. Her breath caught. She was on horseback, and not alone. The realization slammed into her the moment she felt him. Azuron's arms caged her in, his body pressed firmly against her back as he held the reins. One of his hands rested low on her waist, keeping her steady, possessive, immovable. Her first instinct was to thrash, to fight, But the moment she did, his grip tightened.
Try it.
He murmured, voice low in her ear.
See how well that ends for you.
Sienna's teeth clenched. She hated how effortlessly he handled her, how in control he was. She turned her head, glaring up at him.
Let me go.
Azuron didn't even look down.
No.
The single word made her stomach twist. Her breath came faster, her body still shaken from whatever spell he had used to make her black out. She barely even remembered how they got here. The last thing she recalled was the press of his lips against her ear, the darkness swallowing her whole. She hated that voice. She hated that his body was so warm, even as the night air burned against her exposed skin. But most of all, she hated that part of her felt safer here than in the cold, crumbling throne room. Azuron must have noticed the tension in her muscles, because he let out a low hum of amusement.
Comfortable?
Sienna turned, intending to snarl something back. But the moment she moved, the horse jerked beneath them. She lost her balance. Her hands flew out, grabbing onto the first thing she could, which just so happened to be him. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his coat, the firm muscle beneath too solid, too real. Azuron finally looked down at her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something dangerous. His voice dropped to a whisper.
You're already clinging to me, princess.
The words were mocking, filled with dark amusement. Sienna's face burned. She let go immediately. Azuron chuckled, and the ride into the darkness continued. Chapter 4. The arrival at the fortress, the ride felt endless. Sienna's muscles ached, her body stiff from hours of being forced against him on horseback. Every time she shifted, she felt Azuron's presence behind her, solid, unmoving, an unrelenting reminder of how trapped she was. She hated the way his heat bled into her skin, the way his breath ghosted against her temple every so often, like he knew it unsettled her. But what she hated most was how easily he controlled her. The fortress finally loomed ahead, a monstrous silhouette against the night sky. Jagged spires of black stone, torches burning blue instead of gold, like something out of a nightmare. Sienna's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a castle. This was a kingdom carved from war. The gate swung open before them, guards standing at attention in armored silence. No bows, no welcomes, only obedience. The horse slowed, and before she could react, Azuron moved. One arm curled tighter around her waist, and with one swift motion he lifted her off the saddle. Her feet barely touched the ground before his grip slid from her waist to her wrist, pulling her forward with calm, unshakable force. "Keep up," he murmured, without looking at her. Sienna dug her heels into the dirt.
I am not.
Azuron turned sharply, closing the distance. She barely had a second to react before he was there, towering over her, his face inches from hers. The torches cast shadows across his sharp cheekbones, his expression unreadable. And then, he moved closer, slowly, deliberately. His breath brushed against her lips. Her body locked up, a shudder threatening to betray her. Azuron noticed. His lips curled, his grip on her wrist tightened just slightly. Not painful, just enough to make her aware of him.
You are mine now, little queen.
His voice was low, dark velvet, wrapping around her like a whispered sin.
Try to run, and I'll make sure you regret it.
Sienna clenched her jaw, fire burning through her veins.
I will never belong to you.
Azuron let out a soft chuckle, his free hand lifting to trace the edge of her jaw with the back of his knuckles.
We'll see.
And then, he turned away, dragging her with him. Chapter 5. The first night in his domain, Sienna expected a cell. She expected chains. Instead, Azuron brought her to his own chambers. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud. Sienna swallowed hard, glancing around. The room was nothing like she imagined. It was massive, lined with dark bookshelves and a massive black canopy bed. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering light across the walls. The scent of smoke, leather, and something distinctly Azuron filled the air. Her stomach turned.
Why am I here?
She demanded. Azuron shrugged off his coat, placing it over the back of a chair.
You'd prefer the dungeons.
Sienna's fingers curled into fists.
I'd prefer not to be here at all.
Azuron turned to her slowly. His gaze dropped, scanning over her in a way that made her skin prickle.
That is no longer your choice.
Her breath caught in her throat. The weight of his words settled into her bones. No escape. No freedom. She was his. Sienna moved before she could think. She lunged for the door, only for Azuron to catch her in an instant. His arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her back against him with effortless strength. Her back collided with his chest. His lips dipped to her ear.
You should know better than that.
Sienna struggled, but his grip only tightened. His bare hand slid up her waist, fingers skimming the curve of her ribs. Too slow, too deliberate. Her body betrayed her. A shiver ran through her, heat licking up her spine. Azuron exhaled, his lips barely ghosting over her skin.
You'll feel it, don't you?
Sienna froze. His voice was barely a whisper, but it settled into her bones, wrapping around her like a chain. She hated him. She hated that he was right. Azuron's grip loosened, just slightly. And then he did something cruel. He let his fingers trail down her arm, his touch feather-light, lingering at her wrist, where her pulse pounded wildly.
Your body betrays you, little queen.
Sienna ripped herself away from him. Her breath was unsteady. So was her heart. Azuron simply watched her, a slow smirk tugging at his lips.
Get some rest.
He turned away, removing his gloves, setting them aside.
You'll need it.
Sienna stared at him, rage and something else swirling in her veins. She didn't move. Azuron glanced over his shoulder.
Unless you'd rather I help you sleep.
Sienna stiffened. His smirk deepened.
Didn't think so.
And with that, he stepped away, leaving her alone in the darkness. Chapter 6. The first fight. Sienna refused to eat. She refused to speak to him. But on the third night, something in her snapped. She had tried again to escape, tried to find any possible way out of his fortress, and Azuron had caught her. Again. This time, he wasn't amused. He dragged her back inside, the storm raging behind them, his grip harder than before. The door slammed shut. Azuron turned sharply, and before Sienna could react, she was pinned against the wall. His body caged hers in, his hands braced on either side of her head. His breathing was shallow, sharp.
You don't listen, do you?
Sienna glared.
I'm not your captive.
Azuron exhaled a sharp, humorless laugh. Then, he moved closer.
You are mine, Sienna. Every breath, every look, every defiance.
His knee nudged between her thighs. Her entire body locked up. His lips brushed her jaw, so close to her lips, yet not close enough.
I will break you.
His voice dropped, rough and dangerous.
And I'll make sure you love every second of it.
Sienna's breath shattered. Her body screamed to fight, to push him away. But she didn't, because she wasn't sure who would truly win if she did. Chapter 7. His punishment. The storm had passed. The fortress was silent. Sienna's heart pounded in her throat as she slipped through the dimly lit corridors, her bare feet silent against the cold stone. She had spent the past 2 days studying everything, watching the guards, memorizing their shifts. Azuron was always near, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes, waiting for her to slip, to bend. But she wouldn't. Not now. The main doors were too heavily guarded, but there was another way. A ledge, narrow, dangerous, leading toward the outer walls. Sienna's breath shook as she slid through an open archway, stepping onto the edge. Below was nothing but darkness, If she fell. She swallowed hard. No time to think. She moved. The stone was rough beneath her fingers, the night wind biting against her skin. Her pulse roared in her ears as she inched forward. Slow, careful. One misstep and a sharp gust of wind slammed against her. Her balance wavered. Sienna sucked in a breath, clutching the stone tighter. She could do this. She had to. A hand closed around her wrist. Cold. Strong. Unforgiving. Her stomach dropped. Before she could even register what was happening, she was yanked backward, hard. She collided against something solid, unmovable. Him. Azuron's grip burned against her skin, his body heat searing through the cold. Sienna gasped, struggling, but it was useless. His arms caged her in, dragging her away from the ledge, back into the fortress. The doors slammed behind them, and then she was pinned. Hard. Her back hit the wall, his hands braced on either side of her, his chest rising and falling with controlled fury. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Azuron's head was lowered slightly, his breath brushing against her cheek. Sienna's own breathing was unsteady, her body still buzzing from the near fall. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken, but she could feel it, the rage curling beneath his skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, dark.
You are a fool.
Sienna lifted her chin.
And you are a monster.
His fingers twitched, like he was holding himself back. Then, he moved. Slowly. Too slowly. His fingers brushed against her throat, tracing the faint, erratic pulse beneath her skin. Sienna's breath caught. Azuron's touch was not gentle. It was measuring, like he was considering something. Her stomach twisted. Would he kill her? Punish her? She didn't know which was worse. Azuron exhaled sharply, his hand dropping to her waist instead. And then, he lifted her. Sienna let out a startled gasp as he set her on a nearby table, his body still pressed between her legs, keeping her trapped. His fingers curled against the edge of the wood, knuckles white. His voice was razor sharp, dripping with warning.
I should chain you to my bed for this.
Sienna's heart slammed against her ribs. Azuron leaned in, his lips a breath away from her ear.
Tell me, princess.
His voice was a low, dark whisper, trailing down her spine like a blade.
What exactly were you planning to do out there?
Sienna's throat was dry. She refused to speak. Azuron's hand slid up her thigh. Not soft, not kind. A warning. Sienna sucked in a sharp breath.
You wouldn't.
Azuron let out a dark chuckle, fingers trailing higher before stopping. His lips brushed against her ear.
Try me.
A sharp shiver ran through her, not from fear, something far worse. Azuron exhaled sharply, pulling back just enough to look at her. His gaze was darker than before, controlled, calculating, but beneath it, something unhinged. Then, he let go. Sienna barely had time to register it before he turned away, pacing. His hands clenched into fists. He was furious, and he was holding himself back. Sienna swallowed hard, still seated on the table, still feeling the ghost of his touch on her skin. Finally, Azuron spoke.
You don't understand what kind of game you're playing, princess.
She stiffened.
This isn't a game.
Azuron laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. He turned, stepping closer.
Oh, but it is.
His fingers brushed against her knee, his voice dropping to a murmur.
And if you keep tempting me like this,
His lips curled.
you won't like how I decide to win.
Sienna's pulse thundered in her ears. He was toying with her, punishing her. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't just about the escape. It was about control, and she had just challenged his. Azuron tilted his head slightly. Then, as if dismissing her entirely, he turned toward the door.
You're done for tonight.
He opened it, then stopped. Without turning back, he gave one final warning.
Next time, Sienna,
His voice was low, dangerous.
I won't let you off this easy.
And then, he was gone, leaving Sienna alone, breathless, her skin still burning, and her heart beating too fast. Chapter 8. Bound to him everywhere. The next morning, she woke up to find him already waiting. Sienna sat up slowly, her body still stiff from the night before. She had barely slept. How could she, after everything? Azuron stood near the window, dressed in black and silver, his coat left open, revealing the sharp lines of his chest. His sword rested against the table beside him. He hadn't spoken yet. He was watching her. Sienna's pulse skipped. Then, he moved. He strode toward the bed, his boots echoing in the quiet room. He stopped just beside her, looking down at her like she was already his. And then, without warning, his hand wrapped around her wrist. Firm, unyielding. Sienna's breath hitched.
What are you doing?
A cold metal cuff snapped shut around her wrist. She froze. Her gaze darted to his hand. A thin, dark chain extended from the cuff, wrapped around his fingers. A leash. Her chest tightened. You... Azuron gave a slow, sharp smirk.
You're not running again.
Sienna yanked at the chain, fury burning through her veins.
You can't do this.
Azuron tilted his head.
Can't I?
His fingers tugged slightly, just enough to pull her toward him. She caught herself with her free hand, barely avoiding falling into his chest. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Azuron's voice was silk and steel.
You're coming with me today.
Sienna's brows furrowed.
Where?
Azuron's smirk widened.
To the royal court.
Chapter 9. The Dance of Defiance. The ballroom was grand, glittering with firelight. Lords and ladies in rich, jewel-colored silks whispered among themselves, their gazes flickering toward Sienna. She knew why. She was on display. A captive, bound to him by a delicate-looking chain, thin enough to appear decorative, but stronger than iron. Azuron hadn't let go of it once. He had guided her into the hall without a word, his expression unreadable, but his grip on the chain had been firm. A silent warning. She could feel their stares, the whispers curling around her like smoke.
Is that her? The girl he stole.
She's breathtaking, but look at her eyes. She hates him.
Yes, she did, but Azuron, he didn't seem to care. He led her through the hall, his presence as commanding as ever, until they reached the center of the ballroom. The music shifted. A waltz. Sienna's stomach dropped. Azuron turned to her, his striking blue eyes glinting. And then, he extended a hand. Sienna stared at it, refused to take it. Azuron's fingers twitched slightly, his smirk returning. And then, in one smooth motion, he used the chain to pull her into him. The world tilted. Her breath hitched as she collided against his chest, his arm already locking around her waist. The ballroom vanished. There was only him, and the dance had already begun. Slow, sinister, suffocating. Azuron's grip was unbreakable, his movements flawless. Every step guided her, controlled her, left her with no choice but to follow.
You don't like being here.
He murmured, his breath ghosting against her cheek.
But you wear defiance beautifully.
Sienna's fingers dug into his shoulder.
Let me go.
Azuron spun her. The motion sent her reeling, his grip the only thing keeping her upright. When she faced him again, he leaned in, his lips barely brushed against her ear.
No.
Sienna's heart slammed against her ribs. The music swelled. Azuron guided her effortlessly, like he had done this 1,000 times before. But for her, this was war. She didn't want to follow his lead, didn't want to feel the heat of his touch, the way his fingers pressed into her waist like a brand. And yet, her body moved in sync with his. Perfect. like she belonged in his arms. She hated it. Azuron's grip tightened.
Look at them.
His voice was smooth, taunting.
They already believe you're mine.
Sienna's nails bit into his shoulder.
I will never be yours.
Azuron's smile was razor sharp. And then, he dipped her. The world tilted again. Sienna sucked in a breath, her back arching as he held her in place, completely at his mercy. His striking blue eyes burned into hers. The room didn't exist. Nothing did, except this moment. Azuron lowered his head, his lips a whisper away from hers. And then, he stopped. Not because he had mercy, but because he wanted her to know, wanted her to feel how easily he could take, and how easily she would fall. Sienna's heart pounded. Azuron's smirk deepened. And then, he pulled her back up, effortlessly, the dance continuing. Like nothing had happened. But something had. Because now, the tension was unbearable. Because now, Sienna knew. Azuron didn't need to chain her to own her. He only needed time, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Chapter 10. His control tightens. The aftermath of the dance lingered like an unspoken storm. Sienna was still fuming when Azuron led her back through the dimly lit corridors of the palace. His grip on the chain was light, too light. Like he knew she wouldn't run, like he had already won. That alone made her want to scream. She didn't speak, didn't fight, not yet. She needed to be smart. She needed to understand him before she could destroy him. But something was different tonight. It wasn't just the usual cold, calculated control in Azuron's movements. It was the way his jaw ticked as they passed a group of noblemen, the way his fingers curled tighter around the chain when a passing lord dared to let this gaze linger on her. Sienna felt it, the shift, the subtle possessiveness. Her lips parted slightly, realization striking her. Was that jealousy? Azuron didn't pause, didn't react. But when the nobleman smirked, the chain suddenly went taut. Sienna stumbled forward, yanked closer to his side. She gasped softly, catching herself against his arm. Azuron finally spoke, voice low, smooth.
Keep looking.
He said not to her, but to the nobleman.
I'll carve your eyes out next.
The man's smirk vanished. He turned quickly, disappearing down the hall. Sienna's breath hitched. Azuron exhaled sharply, loosening the chain. His fingers brushed her wrist, almost absent-mindedly. A mistake. Sienna's eyes narrowed. He was slipping, just for a moment. But it was enough. Azuron may have been controlling her, but she had just found a way to control him.